In this video, we're going to be taking a look at percents, fractions, and decimals. And you'll need to have your Go Math book out and turn to page 209, your math journal, and a pencil. So the essential question we're going to be taking a look at is how can you write equivalent percents, fractions, and decimals? So we'll first of all take a look at writing percents as decimals and fractions. We can see at the top there, it says you can write a percent as an equivalent fraction or as an equivalent decimal. Equivalent percents, decimals, and fractions all represent equal parts of the same whole. So in other words, whether you're representing a fraction, a decimal, or a percent, either of those, if they're all equivalent, they all represent the same thing. So let's look at example number 1. It says Lorenzo spends 35% of his budget on rent for his apartment. Write this percent as a fraction and as a decimal. So we have 35%, and first of all, we can write the percent as a fraction. It's important to remember from yesterday's lesson, or from 8.1, that percent is always out of 100. So whatever percentage it is, it's very simple to write it as a fraction. So 35% is 35 over 100. If it's 75%, it's 75 over 100. Remember, percent means per 100. So it's very easy to take a percent and put it into a fraction. However, you do need to simplify it as well. And we would know the greatest common factor of 35 and 100 is 5. So we can divide both numerator and denominator by 5, giving us 7/20. Now, if we're writing a percent as a decimal, remember any percent is per 100. So we have 35 hundredths. All right, so if we're writing 35 hundredths as a decimal, we can just write 0.35. And remember, a percent is always per 100. Okay, so 35 hundredths. Now, another way to understand this is if you have a percent, you just take that decimal to the right of 35 and move it over to the left 2 places to put it as a decimal. So 35 hundredths there. So if we take a look at 35%, it can be written as a fraction 7/20. Remember, we simplify it from 35 hundredths, and also written as a decimal as 35 hundredths as well. So let's take a look at number 1 together. So we have 15%. We're going to write that as a fraction and as a decimal. So easily we know 15%, since it's per 100, is 15 hundredths. However, we do need to simplify this. And I know that the greatest common factor of 15 and 100 is 5. So I'm going to divide both numerator and denominator by 5, which is going to give me 3/20. So written as a fraction, 15% is 3/20. And also I know that 15 hundredths, going back to writing this as a decimal now, we're going to write this as a decimal, 15% is 15 hundredths as a fraction. So I can just write that as a decimal, 15 hundredths. Or another way to remember this, any percent, what you do, if you want to change that to a decimal, you move the decimal 2 places to the left. It's understood that a decimal is to the right of that 5. We put a decimal there for 15 hundredths as well. So we have 3/20 and also 15 hundredths. You can put a 0 in front of that. Okay, let's take a look at another one. I'll erase this so we have some more room there. Let's take a look at number 2. We have 48%, so right away we want to write that out as 48 over 100 if we're turning this into a fraction. So 48 hundredths, but we need to simplify this, and I can divide both 48 and 100. Greatest common factor is 4. 48 divided by 4 is 12. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So 12/25 written as a fraction. I'll just keep it over there. A little tricky to write it on that line. And then also writing this as a percent. So I have 48, writing this as a decimal. So I know the fraction is 48 hundredths. The decimal I can write is 0 and 4800ths written as a decimal, or if you remember before, I have my percent, and I just take that decimal, which is understood to be to the right of that 8, and move it over 2 places for 4800ths. So you can see 12/25ths and 4800ths are both equivalent to 48%. Now what I would like you to do is number 3 all by yourself, and you can work on that now. Okay, the two answers here, we have 4/5 for 80%, and then also you could write this as 80/100ths as a decimal, or just 8/10ths. Both would be equivalent to 80%. Now what I would like you to do is number 6, and you can work on that now. So 40% written as a fraction in simplest terms is 2/5, written as a decimal is 4/10ths, or you could even have 40/100ths. Both would be equivalent to 40%. Now we're going to continue to take a look at this topic on page 210 in your Go Math book. And what we're going to look at, we're going to use models, and that can help you understand how decimals, fractions, and percents are all related. So let's take a look at Model A. It says 78/100ths. We're going to model 78/100ths by shading a 10 by 10 grid. And we did this in the previous lesson. So what you'll need to do, I'm not really able to do this on my computer too well, so I want you to shade in 78 of these squares, representing 78 out of the 100 that are shaded in. So shade in 78 of these squares. And then I could see that 78/100ths equals 78 out of 100. In other words, 78 of those squares out of 100 are shaded in. Okay, so then I could see 78, we'll write this in together, out of 100, or 78% of these squares are shaded in. Alright, so you can see the amount of squares shaded in out of 100. Remember, percent means per 100. 78 squares are shaded in, 78/100ths are shaded in, and also 78% of those squares are shaded in. Let's take a look at letter B. It says model 1 and 42/100ths by shading 10 by 10 grids. So the first thing you'll need to do, since we have one whole, this first square will need to be completely shaded in. So 100, all 100 of these will be shaded in. So we can see that. And then 42/100ths means I'm going to have to shade in 42 out of the 100 on my second grid. So shade in the whole entire grid, first grid, the whole thing, and then 42 out of the 100 over here on the second one. So 1 and 42/100ths equals 100 out of 100 of these shaded in, plus 42 out of the 100 are shaded in, equals 142 out of the 100 are shaded in, equals 1 and 42/100ths. In other words, the 1 represents the whole entire 10 by 10 grid that you shaded in, and then the 42/100ths fraction represents the 42 that you shaded in on that second 10 by 10 grid. Now taking a look at this as a percentage, 1 and 42/100ths equals 100%. In other words, 100% of this is shaded in, plus 42% of my second 10 by 10 grid is shaded in. So 100% plus 42% equals 142% of that grid is shaded in. So let's take a look at Model C together. It says model 125% by shading 10 by 10 grids. And we could see, first of all, we know that if it's 125%, we have 100% of this grid is going to be shaded in. So I want you to fill in 100% of this grid, every square. And then the 25%, I want you to shade in 25 squares on that second 10 by 10 grid. So from there, the model shows that 100%, which is on this first grid, plus 25% equals 125%, and 125% equals the decimal 1 whole and 25 hundredths of the other one. Now we can see 125% equals 100 over 100, which represents 100 out of the 100 squares are shaded in on this grid, plus 25 out of the 100 are shaded in on my second grid. That's going to equal 125 hundredths equals 1 and, so this is the 1 whole, and 25 hundredths shaded in here. And then simplifying this, 1 and 25 hundredths is 1 and 1/4. So let's take a look at the reflect section. It says multiple representations. It says what fraction, and percent equivalencies are shown in each model. Then also explain. So what we can see here, there's 13 squares. So 13 hundredths, 13 out of 100, or 13 hundredths written as a fraction. We cannot simplify that, so that's 13 hundredths. Pretty easy there. And then 13% of this 10 by 10 grid is shaded in. Explaining this, 13 out of the 100 parts are shaded. Now for the next one, we have 1 whole and 30 hundredths shaded in for the second one. So that what that will equal as a decimal is 1 3/10. So this is 1 representing 1 whole, everything shaded in. 3/10 of this is shaded in, or 1 3/10 equaling 130%. So 1 whole and 30 out of 100 parts are shaded. That would be the explanation there. Now what I would like you to do is read through page 211 in your Go Math book, look at those examples, look at the steps, and that'll help you out as we take a look at numbers 8 and 9 together. So I want you to read through page 211, and then we'll work on problems on page 212. So let's take a look at letter A. It says write each fraction as a decimal and as a percent. So 9/25, what we can do is we can divide the numerator by the denominator. Okay, so we take 9 and we divide that by 25, and that will give us our decimal. 36 hundredths would be the decimal. Now when we take a decimal and turn it into a percent, we take 36 hundredths and we move that decimal 2 places to the right for 36%. Now let's say we had a decimal of 1 and 25 hundredths. You would still move that decimal 2 places to the right to turn it into a percent for 125%. So if you're taking a decimal to a percent, you move the decimal 2 places to the right. If you're taking a percent and turning it into a decimal, you move the decimal 2 places to the left. Now let's take a look at number 9 together. We have 7/8. We're going to change that into a decimal. So we take 7, the numerator, divide it by the denominator. You can see I have 875 thousandths is my fraction, or I'm sorry, is my decimal. So 8.875, we would write it that way, or 0.875, and then changing that decimal into a percent, I have 875 thousandths. I take that decimal, move it 2 places to the right for 87.5%. Now I would like you to work on number 2 on page 212. You work on that now. Okay, you should have filled in 53 of the little squares representing 53% and 53 hundredths for the fraction. Now I would like you to work on number 4, and you can work on that now. Now you can see the answer for that is 35 hundredths, also 35%. So let's take a look at the essential question check-in. It says, how does the definition of percent help you write fraction and decimal equivalents? We know that percent means per 100, so any percent can be written as a fraction with the denominator of 100 and then be written in simplest form. Also, any fraction can be written as a decimal by dividing the numerator by the denominator, like I showed you for numbers 8 and 9. So this concludes the video on percents, fractions, and decimals. If you have any questions about this concept, please come and see me.